Welcome to Orthodox Christian Theology. This is Craig Truglia, and today we're talking about forgotten dogmatic councils for the Eastern Orthodox. And this is a topic I'm very excited to talk about because it's not one that people really are aware of in apologetics. It often gets said that after the Seventh Ecumenical Council, the Eastern Orthodox just froze in time and stopped dealing with doctrinal matters. And these doctrinal matters did, in fact, keep getting discussed after Nicaea II. We have the Eighth Ecumenical Council in Constantinople, which bans additions to the creed and changes in papal ecclesiology. And we had the Ninth Ecumenical Council, really Constantinople 920, which, in short, made it where my phone is ringing, so my apologies. But this council made it that, my gosh, it's still going. Goodbye, phone. Bye-bye. So what happened is the Council of 920, I can't take it anymore. I'm going to put on mute 1 second. Hi, live audience. Sorry about that. I'm going to do I think a new introduction because I'll just cut off the beginning. So welcome to Orthodox Christian Theology. This is Craig Truglia, and I am excited to talk about forgotten dogmatic Eastern Orthodox councils. A lot of people think popularly, especially in apologetics, that Council of Nicaea II is the last time the Eastern Orthodox Church settled something dogmatically, and that's just not simply the case. We've had the Eighth Ecumenical Council. We had another council in 920, which is where we get all our canon law from. And today we're going to be discussing the slew of councils that have Pan-Orthodox reception between the 10th and 13th centuries, which in fact settle some pretty specific dogmatic questions for the Orthodox. And of course, we have the anti-Roman Catholic and Protestant councils starting the 15th century, going on into the 19th century. So this idea that the Orthodox have stopped having dogmatic councils after Nicaea II is just false history that needs to die. But I've brought to light, quite a few years in the past, the Pan-Orthodox synods that are against Protestantism, Roman Catholicism, but little has it been discussed, the Pan-Orthodox synods between Nicaea II and the modern era, which are before this reaction to the West. And so that's what we'll discuss today. So that being said, our summary is we think that dogma has only come from 7 ecumenical councils, but in fact, the Synodikon, accepted by all jurisdictions, references the decrees of several additional dogmatic councils. But apologetics, as I discussed, is unaware of these dogmas, and they pertain to icons, reincarnation, how we theologize, which is interesting, skepticism, Platonic forms, theological methodology, Eucharistic atonement, Eucharistic and atonement theology, the authenticity of Christ's humanity, and Gnosticism. So we've had quite a few dogmatic councils and on questions that the Roman Catholics have not settled yet. So to say, I kind of say that half in jest because those are actually not, you don't have to settle everything per se, but there is a ecclesiastical mechanism to settle dogmatic questions. And so we'll discuss those today. But before we get going, I just want to remind people, if shows like these bless you, like, share, subscribe, and of course, go to orthodoxchristiantheology.com/donate to support the churches in Cambodia. That includes donating, whether it's Venmo, Patreon, PayPal's preferred, but any way which you could donate that helps support the missionary work in Cambodia. $10 translates a saint's life into the Khmer language, which is the Cambodian language. Whether it's $10, $100, whatever you want to donate, your donations are appreciated. So if there's something new here that you haven't learned before and you appreciate it, please support churches in Cambodia to show that appreciation, and that is much appreciated by me. So first, we got to talk about the Synodikon, because people are used to ecumenical councils, but we're not used to the Synodikon being like this kind of conciliar means in which doctrines are disseminated and settled. So let's talk about very briefly what it is. Though with local variations, All synods in use of Orthodoxy employ or maintain the Synodikon in an episcopal and monastic context. So it starts in 843, and over time additions are made to the Synodikon with conciliar approval and different local jurisdictions, because all the bishops in those jurisdictions do the Synodikon service, assent to the doctrines and dogmas disseminated in the Synodikon. This is a way of doing things that doesn't exist in Roman Catholicism. So people that kind of make Orthodoxy this Roman Catholic light, and they don't actually study the real Orthodox faith, are not aware of this mechanism because it's just not a Roman Catholic mechanism. And so for those that say, well, this is a change, it's a kind of change, but so is the ex cathedra Pope could settle things alone is a kind of change as well. The Pope doing that only happened for the first time in the 19th century, for example. But the Synodikon, it's still a conciliar way of doing it. The Synod still has to accept it. The bishops all do it. It's just not all the world synods meeting together to do it. It's just rather, it gets written by one synod, whether Bulgaria, usually Constantinople, and then all the synods and their bishops start doing the same service. And so by commemorating the same things, they now assent to the same faith of the council, which started these Synodikon anathemas and other teachings. Now, as I was kind of referring to before, the document's amended between the 9th to 14th centuries. It does contain Pan-Orthodox dogmatic pronouncements. There's some misinformation on this question, such as by heretics. There's the blog Shameless Orthodoxy. He's sadly Universalist. And the claim is like, oh, well, Romania doesn't have the anathemas against John Italis, which because there's an anathema against Universalism and stuff like that. And this is just not true. I was literally looking at a I think it's from the year 1700, Romanian Synodikon. It's in the theological journal Revista Theologica. It was sent to me by our Moldovan priest friend in Cambodia. Now he's in Thailand. And to make a long story short, the anathemas against John Italis are in that Romanian Synodikon. So this idea that what's popularly in Synodikon, like in the John Constantinopolis website, is somehow not what everyone receives, it's just not true. I was reading the Serbian Synodikon, and even though it's abbreviated, and we'll get to that in a second, it's abbreviated, it does contain a condemnation against John. And so it does show you that they may abbreviate things for the sake of brevity, but all the synods have the same Synodikon. There's no real substantial difference. Now, just to give a little context, jurisdiction may do things differently. Commonly, all the bishops and the abbots of monasteries perform the service annually. All right. Some people have gone, well, the bishops in town, he didn't do it. Or I went to this monastery, they didn't do it. I'm just saying traditionally what was done. And some years, for whatever reasons, it may get skipped. But for example, when's the last time you heard a decree of any of the ecumenical councils read out at a church service, right? So it doesn't always happen, even if all the bishops accept it. Now, I want to talk about something that people may not understand about the abbreviations to the Synodikon. Having actually attended multiple Synodikon services, it's on the Sunday Orthodoxy, it's the first Sunday of Lent, people are hungry and tired. And so sometimes they abbreviate the service because honestly, they're hungry and tired and they don't want to keep the service longer than they have to. And so people confuse these abbreviations for like the bishops rejecting what's in the document. And that's not the case. Sometimes these abbreviations are made for purely practical considerations. And so just be aware, yes, there's service abbreviations like the Shameless Orthodoxy blog talks about, but not for the reason people think. Generally speaking, these abbreviations are made for documentary and sometimes purely practical reasons. People are hungry. We have this from Orthodox Phronesis. Hey, Craig, it's good to see you again. I just wanted to say I really appreciate this channel, the work you've been doing. That recent video about the Greek priest shed light on important nuance. And yeah, that was a cool one when I sat in that service and I go, well, this proves wrong all those people that say Go Arch is terrible, it's irredeemable. You know, you don't have traditional Orthodoxy taught in a normal Orthodox church. It's only ROCOR or whatever. It's all over Orthodoxy. And this was the most middle of the road, normie Orthodox church you could imagine. I just didn't talk about the priest or the actual church itself, just as to avoid unwanted attention from the apologetics community. So anyway, with the Synodikon, laity do attend these services. They're doing the anathemas per se alongside with the clergy that do the anathemas. So the reception criteria for these Synodikon services is equivalent to the ecumenical councils because it's actually commemorated with the laity, right? They're not just dogmatic pronouncements, and canons that are, the dust has to be blown off them by bishops and no one ever sees these things. The Synodikon has laity attend. I attended the Synodikon services in my local jurisdiction. And so they've been received as profoundly as ecumenical councils have been received. These services are certainly dogmatic. If you read their content, they have dogmatic teachings on issues of doctrine. So they're certainly dogmatic. And many apologists are aware of these teachings is because, one, they've never attended a Synodikon service, and two, they kind of import this idea of Roman Catholic magisterial mechanisms into the consensus-driven reality of Orthodoxy. So they don't recognize this is really how doctrine gets done in Orthodoxy, is in what you see in the Synodikon. The decrees of ecumenical councils really wouldn't mean that much if it weren't for the fact that we have church services dedicated to these things. And then the sermon is about what that council taught, generally speaking. Right? So this reception from the laity and this actual living out in the church that we have with the ecumenical councils, we also have with the Synodikon. Now, let's talk about the forgotten 10th to 13th centuries of the Orthodox Church. Normally, Orthodoxy knows only of the 7 ecumenical councils, but the apologetics community has over time come to grips with the 8th Council and the post-Florentine councils. I'd like to think I was among the vanguard on this issue, and now it's kind of become old hat, which shows you I've kind of done my job in that sense. But I still have more work to do because no one talks about the 10th to 13th century councils, despite their universal reception and, as you can see, extreme importance. And I think this stream will start ending that. You'll see in a couple of years everyone arguing about these councils as well, because it's clear that they are Pan-Orthodox. Now let's start with our first one, Constantinople, 1082. Now, John Italis allegedly taught Mnemopsychosis, which is reincarnation according to karma, essentially. He also taught that Platonic forms are co-eternal with God, and skepticism about kind of dueling and miracles. And so the council pretty much condemned all these things. We do not believe in reincarnation. We do not believe that truth exists as this outside eternal entity that's co-eternal with God. That, in fact, truth is disseminated and created by God. The scriptures say that I've created justice. I think it's Isaiah 45:8, if I remember right. And so these things that like God creates truth and God's the source of truth. God is truth, right? Truth is not this separate co-eternal thing with God in a sense that like God must conform to the truth. Truth comes and emanates from God. And so this is something that's dogmatized by that council. And generally speaking, it condemns this idea to be skeptical of miracles. But what's interesting about this is in doing this, it disparages the dialectical method in which is derived these ideas from John Italis. And so while the West getting started with scholasticism, the East already had scholasticism because that's where it came from, and they condemned it, right? So if you want to go ask, why don't we do things like the West? It's because this was already condemned. And you're going to see this is not the only council to get into it. Other councils get into more detail. They condemn the methods of scholastics. And this is why Orthodoxy has a theological backbone made up of experience, not made up of syllogisms and speculation. And that comes up first in this council. Now, the next council that's highly relevant is Blachernae in 1094. Now, Leo of Chalcedon taught that icons cannot be destroyed, right? He said, no melting down icons, selling the metal for these icons because they had bills to pay, the royals and fighting these wars and stuff. Says we can't do this. Not because I'm sure the real reason was it just looks wrong. But he gave a theological reason, which is heretical, that what is portrayed in the icon is hypostatically joined to who is represented in the icon. All right. So again, his heretical opinion was that what is depicted in the icon is hypostatically joined to the real person. So the prototype is actually present physically in this icon because of their depiction. And this is kind of taking the teaching of St. Theodore the Studite and pushing it to its further logical extent and mixing this with this popular fervor against melting down holy objects, which is understandable. I wouldn't want people going to my church and melting down the holy objects. But that being said, this removes the real distinction between the prototype and the type, which is actually the real teaching on iconodulia. And so icons are not literally joined to the prototype. The prototype's presence in icons isn't that they are actually there. It's a matter of numerous non-hypostatic causes. So for example, energies from the prototype that go through the icon as if through some sort of medium, or angelic mediation, like angels hear the prayers direct to the icon and bring those to the prototype. It doesn't have to do with hypostatic presence of the prototype. And so if you go, well, this sounds really theoretical and has no bearing in my life, that's actually not true, because this is essentially a denial of the Christianized version that you cannot write the word God, right? Like we have with the Jews. The Jews will put the dash in the O and G-O-D because you can't spell out God. This sort of idea that you do damage to God if you damage an icon or something. And the answer is no, it's disrespectful to damage an icon, right? We want to dispose of icon appropriately, but we're not doing damage to the prototype. And this bears out because we struggle with how do we say God and how do we spell out God and stuff like that. So we actually have a dogmatic council that settles the question for us in 1094. Now, we have a council, Constantinople in 1117, where Eustratius was to conclude that the assumed reality of the word was a separate entity, differing both in dignity and perfection from the divinity. All right. And so this is in the Church and the Rise of the Papacy from Papadakis and Meyendorff, and that's on page 29. And that's where a lot of this presentation is from. And so like this heresy is that somehow because this idea that the hypostasis of the word assumed human nature, that the hypostasis changes along with it, not just in natures, but is like a different person now, right? And so the dignity of this heresy is the dignity of the hypostasis before he assumed human nature was more, because he was just divine, than when he assumed human nature. Now he's has compromised dignity. And so for this reason, Hillism, like Jonathan Hill, again, you don't hear me, saying this in a mean way. I'm not, whatever. But Hillism borders on this heresy, because I've had a very nice Hillite tell me, well, yes, when the hypostasis of the word assumed human nature, the hypostasis changed. The person changed along with it. And so in a sense, the hypostasis was no longer eternal, which is not right, right? The person of Christ is eternal. And the person of Christ assumed humanity and hypostatized human essence into the divine hypostasis of the word. And so Hillism, in essentially denying this, but not getting to the dignity issue, denies the eternity of Christ's hypostasis, because again, I had a Hillite actually do this in conversation. Maybe Jonathan wouldn't. And so there's nothing against Jonathan personally, but we can see the dangers of these speculations bordering on already condemned heresies. And so as a student of Italis, Eustratius used syllogisms instead of a patristic method. Again, like Hillism, this idea that we could just come up with these ideas and, no one ever talked about this idea, really thought about this idea, and we just accept this. And by the way, the people again, we have this with diorites, very similar method. And really the via media is in the middle, right? And I'm not saying J. Dyer personally, I'm saying people espousing both views of both men, is that this idea that we get this syllogized doctrine, and this council rejects it, get this syllogized doctrine, that we need a patristic method of doctrine, and that we don't try to syllogize things that the fathers have never syllogized. And so let me quote the Church and the Papacy, again by Papadakis and Meyendorff. The council states, so this is quoting the council, although there are two natures in the single hypostasis, the incarnate word. Oh, wait, no, this is quoting Papadakis. According to the council, this distinction is to be grasped piously as a distinction of the mind. It is not possible to argue that one of the natures is subject to the other, or that one is imperfect and high priest and the other is not. And so, right, we can't conceive of Christ as having lesser dignity because the natures, because the dignity is hypostatic, right? The divinity is hypostatic. It's in who he is as a person. So we cannot pit like him against himself, right? We're not Nestorians. Now, the council, as I was referring to before, this is to quote the council, condemned the syllogistic method and by saying this: those who insist that the indemonstrable articles of the faith, including matters for which the saints did not use logic, should be approached syllogistically, must be proclaimed not only as impious, but as, I can't read this from here, as insane, as fools and insane. All right. So they must be proclaimed not only as impious, but as fools and insane. So we do not insist upon indemonstrable articles of faith in matters in which the saints did not use logic, right? We accept the teaching of the saints, and this is what this council states. Now, there's a councils in Blachernae in 1156 and 57. I actually got this nifty little book by D.P. Curtin. All right. And he has a lot of these. He has another press called Scriptorium Press. It's like a different Scriptorium Press. You got to check these guys out. Rare stuff, translated nowhere else. And again, not a lot in these councils because all we have are decrees. And don't feel you're left out because all that's in the decrees of these councils is what's already in the Synodikon. The Synodikon essentially covers all the essentials that these councils cover. So what did the Council of Blachernae 1156 to 57 cover? Well, it condemned that the sacrifice of the cross and the Eucharist is offered only to the Father, but rather to the Trinity, and the sacrifice on Calvary is different than the Eucharist. So that's also condemned. It's the same sacrifice. And that the sacrifice on Calvary is not a subjective memorial, right? The Eucharist, rather, is not a subjective memorial. So this kind of Protestant idea was an idea in 1156. And that being said, they also denied this idea that the atonement is hypostatic. And so the heresy is that the offering, receiving the sacrifice, hypostatic as opposed to essential. And so there's several ramifications to this. Not many that I'm going to speculate on personally, but it's an interesting teaching. The sacrifice is received essentially, not hypostatically. And what was the doctrinal reason for this? The prayer during the cherubic hymn during the liturgy was cited as definitive. And that prayer is, for you are the one who both offers and is offered. All right. So for you are the one who offers and is offered. So, right, Christ offers and is offered himself. And so it can't be hypostatically he's offered only to the Father, because that would contradict this hymn. Now, this does, unlike what this commenter says, where he claims it didn't condemn penal substitution. And yeah, it didn't use the words penal substitution because those words didn't exist. No one used the word substitution or penal, in the same sentence for the atonement during that era. But conceptually, it does deny penal substitution, because what is the concept of penal substitution? That that either for the Calvinists, Christ satisfied the wrath of the Father, or to make it for like a lot of these Twitter theologians claim that Christ satisfied the justice the Father demanded. And once we remove the hypostatic element, that when we see these wording in the Fathers, that the atonement in some sense satisfies the Father or is directed to the Father, if it's essential and not hypostatic, if Christ satisfies the justice of the divine essence, right, essentially, now all of a sudden it's not penal substitution anymore, for the reason that it's not a matter of satisfying something that's lacking. It's rather completing something that God requires in what he created. And so I think there's a distinction there. And so you could use this penal language, but because there's nothing wrong with penal language, but it has to be understood consistently with this council. And there's more. So to quote the council, on the contrary, it is he who condescended toward us and assumed our nature, not as a condition of reconciliation, but in order to meet us openly in the flesh. So repeat, on the contrary, it is he who condescended toward us and assumed our nature, not as a condition of reconciliation, right? Not to pay a penalty, but in order to meet us openly in the flesh. And there's more behind this. So let me get more to this. To quote the Synodikon, and I'm going to make this bigger because the words are small. It states, to them who invent and introduce intervals of time into the reconciliation of human nature with the divine and blessed nature of the life-giving and holy and violate Trinity, and legislate that we were first reconciled to the only begotten Word by his assumption of humanity, and then afterwards to God the Father during the salutary passion of the Christ, passion of the Savior Christ, contrary to the blessed fathers who taught that the only begotten reconciled us to himself through the entire mystery of the economy, anathema. Right? So we have to stand the atonement not as a pain of the penalty in the cross, like he had to die to pay a penalty, but rather it was the penalty of human fallenness that was corrected by Christ's entire economy, his whole way of life. By the way, that is referenced in the decree of the Sixth Ecumenical Council. Right? So we see here that the council anathematizes the very logic behind penal substitution. Now, again, people on the internet, they don't want to admit they're wrong, so they're just going to kind of back into this idea that, oh, yeah, well, I believe in the entire divine economy. Great. But the thing is, that's no longer the penal substitution anymore. Penal substitution has the real meaning because penal substitution is not Orthodox terminology. It's a concept from outside of Orthodoxy. And if you take the fathers that use penal substitutionary language, they use it consistently with the idea that Christ's divine life corrects what's lacking due to the fall, right? That the divine economy is what corrects or atones for human fallenness, right? So it's not that some penalty had to be paid to make God happy. It's that human fallenness, humanity was defective according to its tropos, and Christ's economy, his perfect tropos, corrects this. So those of us baptized, have faith, repent, and are joined to Christ mystically in this Orthodox life, thereby partake in this correction and this divine economy, right? What he did for us then becomes ours by him, indwelling us and changing us by his divine energies. And so it's a theory of atonement that's not about penalty and payment of debt, but rather about partaking in divine theosis. So it's very different. So to continue, there's the councils of Constantinople in 1166 and 70. And they also are dogmatic. 1166 condemns that my Father is greater than I, is in the Gospel of John, is about Christ hypostatically as opposed to his human essence. All right. So it's this idea that you can't say, well, Christ is less divine than the Father or something like that, because there are heretics that taught this. And the 1170 Council condemns that Christ's humanity was not lesser than the Father's, right? So essentially this crypto monophysitism that Christ's humanity, like Christ didn't really mean it when he said, my Father is greater than I. It's like, no, we have to accept what the councils say, what the scriptures say, and clearly his humanity isn't as great as divinity. You know, humanity, takes up space. God's divinity is entirely simple, and his energies indwell everything, and Christ's human energies don't. And so, right, like there's a difference here, and both councils parse through these differences. And so, in short, the council upholds a plain reading of the scripture in light of the councils and Christ's genuine humanity. So I'm not going to wax poetically on the ramifications of these teachings, but it's dogmatic and it kind of shows the difference between, let's say, Nestorianism and Monophysitism, and shows how the Orthodox teaching's in the middle. And so it's a clarification which does justice to the scriptures and to Chalcedonian doctrine. Now, lastly, there are the Anti-Bogomil councils. There are also the Palamite councils, but we kind of accept those. So I'm not even going to cover that in this video. But the Anti-Bogomil councils, Bogomilism was a Gnostic sort of proto-Protestantism. And the Synodikon anathemas, which originated from either Serbia or Constantinople, condemned typical Gnostic doctrine. So like henotheism, the idea there's evil creator, Docetism, a rejection of transubstantiation, and it affirms cross-veneration. So we have this dogmatic statement in the Synodikon, which may be borrowing from actually several Anti-Bogomil councils, which I can't put a date on it. And that being said, just dogmatically condemns these heresies. And again, we don't have a lot of Gnosticism presently, but we start seeing these problems in Protestantism, and it's just interesting that they were condemned centuries before, and we don't need to hold the new council to condemn them because they've already been condemned. Now, guys, if you have questions, you can start doing audience questions. So I'm going to have some closing thoughts, and then we'll get into the few questions and comments we have. And the Palamite councils, like I said, are also in the Synodikon of Pan-Orthodox reception. But that's why the Pan-Orthodox reception is because they're in the Synodikon, right? Every jurisdiction has the anathemas for the Palamite councils. And we have a Sunday of Palmas during Lent, which makes it even more obvious that this is what we all affirm throughout Orthodoxy. The Synodikon reflects a vibrant Pan-Orthodox tradition after the age of ecumenical councils. And so this idea that it just stopped without the Pope is just not true. We kept doing it. So that's just fact. Now, it kind of leads to the question, why have professional theologians largely forgotten about these councils? And I think there's a real obvious reason for this. It's like the 800-pound gorilla in the room. Seminary professor versus abbots and bishops being sources of theology. When our source of theology was really the bishop, because there's no professional theologians with white-collar jobs in schools, the abbot or the bishop did this service every year, so they knew it existed. The professional theologian might not even be attached to a monastery. He might not attend Sunday liturgy with a bishop. And so he really only knows about these things in books, and it's less real to him. And because it's less real to him, because he doesn't partake in the services, it somehow is less important. And you take the apologists who only read these books from academics, they don't read the fathers, and they don't attend these services, they're not aware of their existence either. So popularly, people don't know it exists. But for those of us who go to the Synodikon services, and of course the bishops who all do these services, the abbots, that is something that they just know, and it's just obvious. And it's a privilege for me to, again, break this popularly to the world in the modern era, something that should be obvious to all. Now, I do think, upon reflection, that this does show there's a paradigm shift in the dissemination of doctrine, right? Like we moved on from ecumenical councils and started doing things a different way. Now, this sounds wrong. So people are going to cut that up and get the wrong idea. But we've had several of these in church history. Right? Where were the ecumenical councils between 0 to the year 325 when Nicaea occurred? There weren't any. Doesn't mean we didn't have dogmatic decisions made, right? It doesn't matter we didn't settle church-wide issues. We settled matters on Ephesus jurisdiction, on the dating of Easter, on baptism, on the deposition of the Patriarch of Antioch, on the issue of how to receive Gentiles in the church. If we're going to go with the Apostolic Council in Jerusalem, we've had councils that were ecumenical and synods that were local that had Pan-Orthodox acceptance in existence before Nicaea. So that was the original way of doing things. But with a change of government and inertia, cultural inertia, we started having ecumenical councils. And that age of ecumenical councils occurred between 325 to 920. I was reading an article on an old Antiochian Synodikon, And it actually lists the horos of the ecumenical councils, and guess which horos it also includes? 920. Because 920 was considered an ecumenical council. Its canons were even received in the West. And we know this from 2 canon laws in the 10th century, dated like 30 years after the council, and a letter written to a pope in 923 that he accepts that there's no fourth marriages, which was the main issue decided by this council. And so this age of ecumenical synods actually goes to about 920. Again, people don't talk about this, but it's just fact. And it's in Western canon law, and all of Eastern canon law comes from 920. So it's clearly an important high water mark for ecumenical synods, but also the close of the book on ecumenical synods. Because after this, between 920 and 1452, essentially what you have are constantinopolitan synods in communication. Right? We have what we see in the Synodikon. Constantinople has a synod. They may have a bishop of Jerusalem there, whomever. And then that teaching goes out to the Orthodox world. And then when they do their own Synodikon, they add these councils. And we know this is what they did because the Antiochian ancient Synodikon has these councils. You could read the original Bulgarian Synodikon, the later Romanian, et cetera, et cetera. It has these councils. And so that being said, it's a change in how it's done, but what's the same? What's the same with the local synods, right? Sending out the decisions to the world and everyone receiving them, consensus. What's the same with all the world synods meeting in one place and then sending the decision out to the local synod to be received, like the ecumenical councils, consensus. What's the same with the local synod issuing its statement out and then the other synods receiving it, right? Consensus. So what we see in common is consensus-based ecclesiology adjusting itself for a change in cultural and political realities. So if the change in 325 was the end of persecution and government support for the church, the change in 920 was really Rome not taking part of these anymore, right? Rome didn't even attend 920. They just received it after the fact. Unlike the ecumenical councils, where Rome actually at least had a legate present. Even in Constantinople I, Ascolius of Thessalonica actually attended. 920 was different. Rome accepted it after the fact. And so between 920 and 1452, you start having where the councils is held in Constantinople, not everyone shows up, but then they end up receiving it anyway, which, by the way, was starting to occur with the ecumenical councils. So it's just this natural continuation in the direction in which the 5th, the 6th, the 7th, the 8th, and 9th ecumenical councils already went. Now, 1452 to 1918, we have local synods issuing statements of communication in Constantinople. So right now, the center of gravity is not purely in Constantinople, right? We had Yassi have a Pan-Orthodox synod. We had Jerusalem have a Pan-Orthodox synod. So we start seeing it broaden a little bit. But really, again, what's in common? Consensus. Then lastly, we have the modern era, which honestly, I don't think we figured it out yet, because after World War I, the Ottoman Empire falls, Constantinople doesn't get liberated by the Greeks, then gets the open persecution. They can't do what they used to do. And then the Russian church is openly persecuted for most of the century. And so you don't really have local synods doing pan-Orthodox things that are dogmatic. We do have pan-Orthodox synods that are dealing with ecclesiastical stuff. So I don't think we've really come to grips with what's going on yet. And so I would argue we're still doing the local synods issuing statements and communication. But the flavors changed, and I don't know the stereotype of how to say what exactly that is, but we may see it soon. We may see it soon. So that being said, what is the meaning and what's the significance of these paradigm shifts in disseminating doctrine? Well, as I said, the trajectory was determined by constraints by society on the church, right? A change in persecution, imperial cooperation with Rome, imperial centralization, imperial decentralization. It shows you the way church does things with consensus, does roll with the punches of society. And now with the internet, right, and with voting and media, it's going to continue changing, right? Today, with a flattening world, it's going to give rise to some new arrangement with some way of aligning with the canons. And again, I don't think we fully understand how that's going to work out yet, but it's going to happen. And as someone said, ecumenical Zoom meetings, again, these things could really start occurring. right? Like, think about it this way. We used to have minutes of ecumenical councils because there's no way of disseminating what they taught. And now what would be the point of that? You just record everyone talking in a room. We wouldn't pay attention to 2 weeks of people talking, or a year. Like, some of these ecumenical councils take a year to occur. A year of people talking versus, a book like the ones behind me, right? And so it's going to change how we write these documents. Now, most Synodikon related heresies were academic and not popular, right? They're condemning philosophers and syllogisms. So it's got a more narrow theological focus. And so this may affect the people understand these councils, and also why the Synodikon just with abbots and just with bishops, because who's going to care about half this stuff until like literally the last 20 years, right? Where now every armchair layman wants to be a quasi-theologian. Like, again, Orthodox weren't arguing about transubstantiation 20 years ago if they were lay people. You know what I mean? Orthodox weren't arguing about the atonement 20 years ago if they were lay people. And so, in a sense, having the Synodikon where it was made sense, but now it requires more people to talk about it because the lay people are getting more involved with theology, for better and definitely for worse. And so now you want answers to these questions? Go attend a Synodikon or go listen to the services on YouTube, because the whole services are on YouTube. I do think an important thing to keep in mind is the modern apologetics is definitely scholastic flavored. It's people making up problems that no one was even conceiving of before, which is, again, scholastic. If we weren't devising new doctrine and devising problems in which to solve, and we're just accepting what the fathers taught, we wouldn't have half these issues. And so I would say the moral of all these councils is don't do that, right? We've already condemned, even by word, like we read during this stream, the scholastic method. It was called insane. So we're supposed to just accept what the fathers teach, and we don't need to get into syllogisms and scholasticism. It doesn't mean syllogisms have no place in the church or the fathers, but they're used to buttress what's already patristic, not to come up with new problems and come up with new solutions to new problems. It's also worth saying that Universalism is condemned as a doctrine of John Atalis, and so it's not a matter of opinion. There's no hopeful Universalism. Read the Anathemas of John Atalis. It's absolutely positively condemned. All the bishops, whether they like it or not, receive this Synodikon. And yes, even the Romanians and stuff don't listen to the misinformation from Universalist websites. The Synodikons have these condemnations, though there are times abbreviations and even omissions in some versions of these Synodikons, because quite frankly, you do get hungry after hours of liturgy on a Sunday of Orthodoxy. Now, I'm going to end this stream before I do audience questions with total speculation. Maybe we're going to have 12 great councils in Orthodox history, right? A nice round number. What would those 12 be? Well, here's my speculation. First would be either Jerusalem and the year 50 of the Apostles, or Nicaea. Then there's Constantinople I, but also including 382 letter and canon. So you already could see it kind of expands past just the original council. We have the Council of Ephesus, but also the 433 canonical letter to Antioch. So it expands somewhat past the council. We have the Council of Chalcedon. We have the Council of Constantinople II, including the anathemas, and the Council of 536, by the way. So Constantinople II expands certainly years, decades past the actual council, if we go by the conciliar documents and the Henoticons, which affirm the anathemas and affirm the 536 council. Constantinople III and Trullo. So we have a 10-year thing. We have two councils that are understood as one. That's the sixth council. We got Nicaea II and the original Synodikon of 843. So we see decades of separation with that council. Then I guess a little dicier of my speculations, admittedly. But let's just have fun with it. And in the com box, put your own speculation of what the 12 great councils of Orthodoxy are. I put as number 8 the Photian Synods, because we actually have canons and stuff from these synods. 861, we got canons. We all receive them. 867, the creed, it condemns the doctrine of the filioque, which 880 doesn't. So you kind of have to consider 867 in the mix. And 867 was Pan-Orthodox. 880, which condemns additions to the creed and additions to papal ecclesiology. And 920 which I think is necessary, and joined to them, because not only does it condemn fourth marriages, which is canon law in all the Orthodox, it receives Photius as a saint and the canon law of 861 and the previous canon laws. So in a sense, it makes all the previous councils ecumenical. So that's what the 920 council does. And so it's the close of the book on the Photian councils, even though it's after Photius' death. And that means that, in a sense, that's the eighth synod. So I call it the ninth ecumenical council, but I think we could really number it with the eighth for that reason. It's kind of like the Trullo of the eighth ecumenical council, if you want to word it that way. Then there's 9, which it's numbered wrong because of a typo. The Synodikon councils. All right. And just so you know, the 920 council, by the way, was commemorated in an Antiochian Synodikon and a Bulgarian Synodikon. I don't know everything. I'm sure it was in more. So the church considered ecumenical. Then we have the Synodikon councils as number 9, as we discussed today. Number 10 is the anti-West councils, like Constantinople in 1484, condemning the Filioque, Yassi in 1642, Jerusalem in 1672, Constantinople in 1848, condemning the papacy. So we have these additional anti-West councils. And then we have, in the modern era, the housekeeping councils, or the anti-modernist councils. So we see the 1998 council in Sofia, Bulgaria, deciding the Church of Bulgaria. We're going to have a council soon, I presume, on the Ukrainian Orthodox Church. And so that is something that will be settled eventually. And so it's like a housekeeping council. So the idea of maybe what decides autocephaly will be maybe the close of the book on the anti-modernists and the housekeeping councils. But maybe we'll also have a council to decide this calendar question once and for all. And so we seem to be in this era in Orthodoxy of housekeeping councils. So this is the 10th or 11th. And then for the final council, the final council, right? And so what will that be? I don't know. I guess we'll have to see in the end times. So that's my speculation. You can make your own speculations. And again, we could change these numbers around by numbering Jerusalem as the first council or something. So before audience questions, if this show has blessed you, we see here, thank you, Craig. Appreciate your work. Please bless the churches of Cambodia. We need donations. Donations have gone down the last couple of weeks because I haven't done a live show. So please, 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 links are below. Go to orthodoxchristiantheology.com/donate. PayPal's below. Patreon, be a monthly contributor. Patreon's below. Please also do Venmo if that's better for you. Support the churches of Cambodia. We need money to fix the church in Synodikon. The government destroyed part of the walls that are necessary for its security. We're translating saints' lives. Father Roman will have to have pictures soon. He had another baby. We need support. Please, even if it's $1, if you're doing just $5 a month, something's better than nothing. Please support the Church of Cambodia. orthodoxchristiantheology.com/donate. You know, no one's made this available to you before. This is cutting edge stuff in apologetics, obviously not brand new in the world of Synodikon, which happens every year, but something that people need to be aware of. So please, orthodoxchristiantheology.com/donate. So let's do the audience questions. Someone asked this, Victor. He deified the flesh and became the new Adam, right? Christ certainly did. Certainly did. Makes sense, just like how Isaiah, the Son of Man, serves God. All right, so we have that. Is there going to be a link for books on each of these councils? No, because most of these are not translated. The book I was quoting from Meyendorff and Papadakis has a good section on the Christological Council, so you could read that. The Scriptorium Project, I think it's called Scriptorium Project, of Dalcassian Press. So right there, these dudes, this is the only one they translated. I asked them to do 920. We'll have to have DP Curtin on the show. But we need more of these translated, definitely. But here's the thing. Here's the cheat code. Google Synodikon full text. The Synodikon essentially has the decrees of the councils. They didn't get too creative. It's almost the same thing. So you could read the decrees of the councils. They don't really have minutes and all that stuff. So just read. You could read the decrees of the councils there. And that's what's Pan-Orthodox received are these decrees. And so you have the information there. We have this. Is there a difference between reception of Protestant baptisms versus the clear heretics like Arians and Gnostics? It depends. It depends canonically, because generally speaking, Arians were received without rebaptizing them, and Gnostics, I think the canonists say they were rebaptized. They had to make a confession of faith. Though that wasn't always the case. The Marcionites used to be just received during Augustine's time, but I don't think the canonists majority aligned with this in Orthodoxy. And with Protestant baptisms, we have different practices in other jurisdictions, but I think the most correct practice is to rebaptize them because they don't have exorcisms for the water. They don't have correct form. And so it's the right and better thing to do. It prevents problems, I feel. And I think that's what God's calling us for, but I don't think it's the end of the world existentially for people that haven't had the perfect reception. If you've been communing all these years, you may run into difficulties in this life, perhaps, but I don't think God is going to hold things against you. Saith me and not the Lord. Is the Great Moscow Synod of 1666 dogmatic? I need to study more on this. I'm going to say no. I used to think so. I think the deposition is, and I think the rest of the council never was fully received, even in Russia. It's kind of weird. I need to study more on it. And whenever I ask Russians about it, they don't take it seriously enough. There needs to be like a Russian version of Craig Trulli that really jumps into the question. So I don't know. I'll just have to say I don't know for now. Hopefully I can return to the question and have her stream on it. If anyone has the full minutes of that council in the Russian, send it to me and I'll AI translate it and I'll start a serious study of it. Basil asks, how do the anti-Bogomil councils condemn transubstantiation? It condemns that the Eucharist is not the sacrifice because the Bogomils rejected this. And they don't condemn transubstantiation. The anti-Bogomil councils affirm transubstantiation, which affirms the Synod of Jerusalem. So it's worded wrong. So I'll repeat, the anti-Bogomil councils affirm transubstantiation, all right? They affirm transubstantiation. He doesn't want AI bishops. That's not going to occur. And we have this. I forget whether you go over the canons from the ecumenical councils are held because you see the new Protestant apologists cleave the antiquity, try and criticize why all previous canons aren't held. It's not really. I had a show with him, and I think I already kind of corrected him on the record on the show. Like, we have canons in disuse, but it doesn't mean they don't exist anymore. And this use of canons is fine because it's a matter of, like, again, how do we punish people with penances? A canon says something. It's a guide for a penance, but you could give a different sort of penance. It's always existed as spiritual fathers. And the last canon of Trulli even explicitly says as such. So it's a non-issue, to be honest. So anyway, I won't take up more of your time. I appreciate your comments below. I put an open invitation to any of the penal substitutionary types. If you want to debate the topic, I'm fine with it. I'll have a debate someone in penal substitution. It's something where I feel is very clearly condemned by the logic of the Synodikon, as we read today. And so that's a fun issue. But most of all, read the Synodikon, like and share this video. And most of all, as Jesus Rock says, fight to death for the truth, and the Lord God will fight for you. God bless you. Have a great day.